Hi folks, thanks for joining us for another edition of Government Matters. My name is Mike Dobbs. I'm managing editor for Reminder Publications. And this show is going to be a little bit different because normally we do a one-on-one interview with someone. Instead, it's going to be a one-on-three interview with people here. Our theme of the show is about voter turnout. Something is happening in the city of Springfield that's happening around the Commonwealth and also around the country, and that is we're seeing lower voter turnouts. At a time when voter participation is key in determining the course of government, you would think that people would want to vote, would clamor to vote. That's not necessarily the case. So we've assembled a group of people here who are very knowledgeable when it comes to the issues of voting and people's inclinations on whether they're going to vote or not. So let me introduce our guests. This is Linda Matys O'Connell. She is the organizer for the League of Women Voters for the city of Springfield. Next to her is Rick Hurst. He is, of course, the publisher of the African American Point of View. Next to Rick is Gladys Oyola. She is the elections commissioner for the city of Springfield. And then last but certainly not least is Tim Vercellotti. He's a professor of political science at Western New England University, and he is also heading their polling institute. So first of all, thanks very much, folks, for spending part of your afternoon with us here.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so Gladys, I'll go with you first, because if there's one person in the city of Springfield who understands and knows the history of voting trends, what is happening? What is the trend like? Have you taken a look at years past compared to what's going on now and seeing a definite move downward in terms of voting participation?
As I touched on earlier with my fellow panelists, we have seen a downward trend. I think the high in the city of Springfield particularly was in the mid-1980s, where we saw, even though the numbers were lower in terms of registered voters, we saw that there was a higher turnout. For the city council seats at that point in time, you needed over 10,000 votes. You needed actually, in terms of 15,000 votes, to actually win a seat, where now a few thousand votes will get you an at-large seat for city council. So it's definitely a drop, even though now we have over 106,000 registered voters.
So we have more registered voters, but fewer of them are actually participating.
Correct.
So one of the things I wanted to try to address, and you folks may know the answer, is when we start slicing up the reasons for this, what are we talking about? Are we talking about that we can divide this by what kind of demographic group? Is this younger or older voters? Are we talking about white, African American, Latino, or Asian? Are we talking about the influence of having at-large seats versus ward representation? There seems to be a lot of ways of looking at this. And the other thing I need to know, just to frame the conversation, is everyone always talks about an election needs some sort of spark plug. We need to be voting for a president, or we need to be voting for a governor, or we need a hot Senate race, or we need a hot congressional race, which in our district is unlikely until Richie Neal decides he's going to retire. So we always talk about, well, you know, the voter turnout wasn't good because we didn't have some sort of compelling reason to vote. So let me try to pick at some of this stuff and pick your brains here. Tim, in terms of demographics, are there studies to indicate who is voting and who isn't voting? Or can we draw those kinds of conclusions? Or is it fair to draw those kinds of conclusions?
It's difficult to make solid inferences about Springfield in particular without an exit poll, without the ability to be out there intercepting people as they emerge from the polling places to get a sense of who it is in terms of age, race, ethnicity, gender, level of education. But we know generally that voter turnout is correlated with education level and socioeconomic status. The higher your education, the more you feel connected to the community, the more you feel like you have a stake in the system and in the outcome of the election, the more likely you are to show up to vote. There are also some systemic issues, though. No Western democracy has as many elections as we do. We have at least 2 a year. every year. A preliminary and a general election in municipal election years, a primary and a general in even-numbered years, and then the presidential every 4 years. Most other Western democracies do not have that many elections, and you can have some voter fatigue after a while. People think, wow, didn't we just have one? We have another one. We've got to educate ourselves on the candidates, on the issues. It demands a lot of citizens when you have as many elections as we do.
Interesting that you talk about voter fatigue. Linda, I mean, as part of the League of Women Voters, one of the things that you guys do is that you're watching elections, you monitor elections. It seems to me that the length of an election, even for a municipal position, is getting longer and longer. I have to admit, the editorial I wrote this week was in reaction to these media reports that Deval Patrick is thinking about running for president. And my message to him was he better start running now, because it's mid-2018, so he has to have an organizational apparatus set up. He has to have a fundraising apparatus set up. He has to raise his national image. I mean, we all know who he is here, but does someone in Iowa know who Deval Patrick is? He has to reintroduce himself. So it seems to lengthen and stretch out these events to the point that people get fed up with them by the time they actually come to vote. What do you think about that, Linda? When you look at elections, do you think that people, as Tim just said, suffer from voter fatigue and therefore they do not vote because they're just sick of it?
Well, I think voter fatigue is an interesting concept because so few people are voting. I have trouble actually accepting that idea. They may be tired of the whole thing. I think that we really feel a disenfranchisement, a sense that the candidates are not relevant, the candidates are not interesting, the candidates are not representative. Those are the kinds of things that you hear in general. However, I don't think that's generally been true in Springfield. When you look at our last field of candidates, they were a very representative group. In the end, however, we failed looking at the city council at-large race. We had 4 women and 6 men running, and we elected only 1 woman, the incumbent. So we feel a disconnect between what people might want to happen and the votes that they do go, the small number who go, and do go and cast, don't seem to return a desired result that everyone is happy about. So I feel more of a voter disappointment than a voter fatigue.
Okay. Rick, what do you think about that? I mean, your wife has held elective office. Your daughter-in-law holds elective office. Your son holds elective office. So what are you, a slacker, Rick, that you haven't held elective office? Do they talk about you at Thanksgiving? I mean, come on.
Believe me, I ran in 1969, 1972, I think it was, and more recently. And I just happen to be a loser when it comes to elective office. There's no other excuse. And I back people who can win. But no, I think it's so complex, it's very difficult to put your thumb on this thing. Everything that's been said so far is real. I would suggest that we examine more closely what happened when Barack Obama ran for office, because the black vote came out in greater numbers than ever before. In fact, it was bigger than the white vote. And that has been unusual, although I do believe the black vote has been trending up over the years once the civil rights movement sort of materialized in the form of voter rights legislation and what have you. But I mean, I think there's some more sinister problems here too. And not the least of which is that we prefer incumbents. And the powers that be prefer incumbents. And whenever, the closer we get to elections, the more noise you begin to hear about incumbents. And so, and you don't get anywhere near the encouragement for non-incumbents to run. They don't get the kind of media incumbents get. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. Mm-hmm. It just is. If you watch what's going on now, Mayor Sarno's image is being lifted by the media. but so won't Ritchie's be, and across the board. When you have the council elections and the school committee elections, the incumbents are lifted, and the non-incumbents aren't getting a lot of play. But I mean, the fact is, we had more non-incumbents this time, I think, than ever before. I saw an uptick, and you can confirm this, I saw an uptick in the minority community because a lot of minorities were running for the offices. That was encouraging. But I don't know I think the reason why people generally don't, in the black community, I'm just not an overall expert, but in the black community, I just think that there's a need for inspiration, number one. And that's what Barack Obama, I think, signified. But the other, I think, is education. And I don't mean education in the specific sense. I mean education when you get closer to the election, you got to talk about it more. And you got to talk about it a lot. And you got to let people know that this is what's going on. I think a lot of elections go by and people don't even know they're going on.
I agree with you, because I will talk to people, and I'll, since I try to cover the local elections a great deal myself, and I'll talk to someone, they'll say, oh, well, when is that? You know, it's like they're not aware, and it doesn't matter how much work Gladys does in saying this is election day or this is the deadline to register. It doesn't seem to matter. It seems to be lost on certain people. I just want to bring up one thing. Tonight, I just heard a promo for this, for a report on All Things Considered this evening on NPR. And it was looking at the number of African Americans who did not vote in the last presidential election, but did vote during the 2 Obama elections. And the reason that the people who were interviewed said is issues pertaining to African Americans were not being discussed by either candidate. So they essentially sat it out because they weren't hearing the types of things discussed that they feel are important to be discussed.
And I think that's true. I think Hillary, I think she was a little confident with the idea that she had the election and didn't appeal that black vote. But that black vote has always been taken for granted by the Democratic Party. I think that stifles the vote itself.
May I make a point?
Sure.
Because I find I find the idea of both voter disappointment and, on the other hand, who is speaking about issues that are important. If you look at our last city council race, we had multiple candidates, very diverse, many African Americans, women, men, Latinos, and yet we didn't manage to turn out a greater number of voters, if I'm correct, Gladys, right? In our in the preliminary, I think that it was 5% of registered voters. The general election was 9%, and people were out there talking about nitty-gritty, very personal, important issues to the electorate, but it never grew to the tipping point.
And I want to ask Gladys this. So in analyzing voter turnouts, we all heard that one of the reasons that we needed to go to ward representation, besides the fact that the Springfield City Council generally, it was generally composed of what? A whole group of white guys from Forest Park with, for many years, with one obligatory African American and maybe, just maybe, a woman, all right? That seemed to be the shape and figure of our city council. That ward representation would change that, which it has. We have a far more reflective group of people on the council than we did before. It's not perfect, but because we only have one woman on the council right now, but at least from an ethnic point of view, it reflects the city far better. But did ward representation really turn out the vote? Did people get excited about that?
In my estimation,
Yeah.
just from looking at the numbers, it did not. And to Linda's point, we did have a diverse field. I mean, in this past city council and school committee election cycle, it was, since ward representation began, it was the most diverse field of candidate. It was the most women that ran, the most women of color that ran. But I think this speaks to both what Fred and Linda said, was we as a collective, so not we as the League of Women Voters or we as African Americans or we as the City of Springfield election office, I think that the candidates as well didn't turn out the vote. So there were certain candidates, and to Rick's point was the candidates that are incumbents know that there is a certain, leverage in being an incumbent. And so driving the vote and driving voters out there may not always play in their best interest, especially when we had 2 empty seats. It's a field of 5 for at-large. And so driving out voters means you're going to drive out someone that's possibly going to cast 5 votes. And that may push your numbers down if you're an incumbent. So I think even though ward representation was kind of one of the selling points of it initially was this is going to, be the silver bullet that's going to drive all of, the communities out to vote. All the wards 1 through 8 will be excited because they get to choose their own representation. That proved not to be true, in my estimation.
Tim go ahead, sir, sorry.
I saw a slight uptick in the Hispanic vote.
Yes.
And
We're the first, probably.
yeah, and I think it's the beginning of an increase in the sophistication within the Spanish community. That's very important, and I think that's going to pick up momentum over time because that is a potentially huge block of votes that has not been tapped into.
Well, and to your point also, Mike, is when we have a race that drives interest, right? So the Barack Obama election of 2008 and 2012, in Springfield, we saw that 60% voter turnout or that 54% voter turnout citywide, which was unheard of with the amount of voters that we had. When we have a candidate that is interesting to a certain electorate, they will come out. So in this past election, even though the turnout was low, for wards 4 and 5, we had an increase. Why? Well, there was a certain candidate, there was Tracy Whitfield, who's as a woman, went and knocked on doors. So she was at every single event. She was actually out there physically kind of beating that drum. So there were candidates, her among them, that were actually out there doing the door-to-door. I think that's one of those things, what's old is new. And even in this age of like social media, and as a candidate, I take a picture and I post it online, I don't think that appeals to voters as much as that door knocking and that one-on-one.
Well, that's absolutely true. And before I ask Tim a question, I'll just bring up, if we look at the sheriff's race, we saw candidates like the winning candidate, Nick Kochi, doing a lot of old-fashioned, I'm going to shake your hand and leave you a brochure and introduce myself to you and tell you what my name is and what I've done. And then on the other hand, we had former Mayor Michael Albano, who ran his entire campaign on Facebook. And when I interviewed the former mayor the afternoon of Election Day, he said that he felt that voters were insulted by a crude political turn as, hi, I'm Mike Dobbs, I'm running for city council. I'm not really running for city council just yet. I get in trouble with my wife when I say that. But believe it or not, people want to meet their candidates. They want to look them in the eye and say, this is my concern. Are you going to address my concern?
My son and my daughter-in-law have done door-to-door every year since they've been in politics, including this last election, along with Janae McDonald, by the way. So there were a lot of candidates that were doing door-to-door, and I think that's part of how they brought at least more people out than would have come out.
Right.
And I don't agree with Mike Albano. I think that's probably the most effective way to be successful in an election. Going door to door, meeting them.
It's still a human enterprise.
Yeah.
Politics is still very much a human enterprise.
You remember for years in Springfield, the incumbent councilors would joke about not doing any door to door, keeping the news down at election time, because they knew that it was to their benefit. And I think that over a period of time helped to suppress people's interest in voting.
Sure.
So, another group that votes less than older, more educated white homeowners are young folks. And talking about knocking on doors, one of the things that we hear from those who are invested in the youth vote is that sometimes two things. Young people may think it's creepy when someone knocks on their door, particularly if they have their name, that's just somehow things have changed. That feels like an invasion. And I have heard that several times from various people quoting research to me. But I also think that what we know from other research, particularly who someone just did recently, not Mass Vote, it was the National Voter Project, and Common Cause, I may have that wrong, but there was research that showed that basically people are uncomfortable if the only contact asking them to vote is vote for me. That there's something about an elections commission, a League of Women Voters, a Common Cause, someone who is actually not partisan and not supporting a candidate. Your counselor at Mass Health who says, hey, have you registered? That there's something about citizens asking citizens to come vote that is more compelling than being asked by a candidate to come out for their purposes.
Well, it's probably because people want to avoid confrontation if it's a candidate they disagree with, for example. But there's a lot of political science research that shows phone banks are just a complete waste of time and money. Direct mail is somewhat more effective because of the way it can be so tailored to specific city blocks, even in terms of public works projects that an elected official might have brought to the community. But knocking on doors, especially if it's someone from your neighborhood and somebody whom you know, is a very powerful way to at least turn people out to vote. And whether it persuades them to vote a certain way or not is a secondary, another issue, but just getting them out.
And so, talking about something as micro as our city council races, to use an example for about voter turnout, Tim, can we take what is happening on that level, but then can we compare it to what's on larger races and larger elections? Mm-hmm. And do we see these kinds of erosions nationally? It's just not Springfield, it's just not Massachusetts. Do we see overall issues with voter turnout?
Again, it depends on the cycle. So the highest turnout is always a presidential cycle, followed by midterm congressional elections, because statewide elections for governor typically coincide, with the exception of a few states. And then municipal elections tend to have the lowest turnout, especially if they're nonpartisan, because, and I agree with Linda, but we have this citizen's ideal that individuals read and weigh both sides of an issue and they're informed about the candidates' positions. But people have very busy lives, they're raising children, they're going to work, they're caring for older members of the family. Sometimes they need that party label when they go into the voting booth as their shortcut. And if you have a nonpartisan election, you don't have that. So you especially have to do your homework about candidates and issues. So in a way, that's why municipal elections tend to see lower turnout, because the opportunity costs to participate are so high. You have to know something. I was
going to say, you're actually going to have to think about what you're doing.
You're going to have to do some homework.
There's another piece of that I've noticed in the last two election cycles in Springfield, which are the only two contemporary ones that I've witnessed, and that is people, because of our ward system, if you're not voting at large, many people have no idea what ward they live in, and therefore who the candidate might be. It gets even more confusing with our school districts, since they combine wards. And I have had people say, I can't wait to vote for my friend Sarah. And guess what? Sarah and you don't live in the same ward, and you're not going to be able to vote for her. And that there is a certain element of, I went out to vote and her name wasn't even on the ballot. So I think that we have an extra difficulty in educating the voters, and educating sounds even like a foolish word, in making sure that people know where they are and who is wanting their vote.
Well, I'll just, as a member of the media, I want to express a certain level of frustration. And the level of frustration is, you know, there are publications such as the ones that I manage, that we really try to cover everybody. We try very, very hard to get profiles on candidates in there. However, we have to be realistic, and the fact of the matter is that generally, aside from WFCR, we do not have a single radio station in the city of Springfield that's covering news. So the idea of having local candidates on radio, just cross that out. Print, it's us, it's Reminder Publications and the Republican. The Valley Advocate no longer really does anything in terms of local elections. I'm getting to you, I'm not leaving you out. I'm just saying, Afro-American Point of View also does this. But the fact of the matter is, then you look at TV, TV is loath to cover elections. They love covering election night, because that's the glamour and sexiness and who's winning and who's losing and all that stuff. But to actually get a group of candidates on camera and saying, so what do you think about this and what do you think about that? That's not really TV's forte. So the problem that I see in terms of what you're saying is that then you have organizations like Focus Springfield that we're trying to put these issues up so at least candidates are having a forum. And I think that part of the problem is that, especially in this day and age where so many people turn to Facebook or to Twitter for their news consumption, they are not allowing themselves to learn about a guy or a woman who is running for a seat in their city. And it's not that I necessarily blame the media, I just see that there are shifts in media that are not advantageous to this process of discussing elections. Rick, I know you want to jump in there.
Yeah, because I don't disagree with you. I just don't think that gets to the core of it.
Okay.
What we do all the time is we have registration drives, and we have candidate nights. Mm-hmm. The only people who come to the candidate nights are the people who are almost certain to vote. And that's a very small number. You're absolutely right.
You're absolutely right.
And if you study, and Gladys might be able to help us on this, I just got an article from somebody who's writing about the registration numbers, and he was addressing the black community. But as it turned out, there are only 10% of the eligible people who are eligible to be registered who are registered. I don't know if that's accurate. But that's the data I got.
10%?
Yes.
At this point, we've registered.
They have registered
everybody who, and that is groups like League of Women Voters, Neighbor to Neighbor, Arise.
They work very hard to register the people. So those two things that we do the most are having diminishing returns, least impact. So the question becomes, what do we do? And I agree with everything everybody said, by the way. I think the core of it is education, but the question becomes, what kind of education? And that's a critical question. We know that we do everything we can through the newspaper, our newspapers. I think community newspapers are very effective. But you need more, and you need it ongoing, and you need it all the time in terms of education. I don't think the issues, believe it or not, are all that significant. The kind of education you need is just drumming it in throughout the year, prior to elections and in between. Vote. Here's why you need to vote. Here's where you go to vote. If somebody doesn't know by the time election comes where they should vote, it's our fault. And it means we're educating them in the wrong way. And I mean, I do believe that's the case. I've run into a lot of people who didn't know where they were supposed to vote. I've been confused. My precinct place has been changed time and time again. And I have to wake up and give thought to, well, where the heck is it? That should not be. People shouldn't have to, by time election time comes up, speculate, where would I go? Because to be frank with you, they'd rather not give it any thought. That's what's happening.
Well, consider this. I'd like your reaction to this concept. We don't teach civics in school any longer. You know, so we don't, you talk about basic education.
Yeah.
So you say to a group of students, okay, this is how our government works, and it works, this is the way it works here in our city, and then how our state, and how the feds. We don't do that type of stuff anymore, do we?
That's the biggest omission in the world, I think. We don't. I remember taking those courses. We don't do it now, and we need it more than ever.
I do believe that the Springfield School Systems is going to be adding a civics course. I just heard that from the social studies department. I think it's going to be 8th grade because they're still doing the history in high school. But that, and there are also a couple bills in the legislature, right, to ask for a more robust civics education. And I think that really is, I mean, that's certainly one of the things that is near and dear to the League of Women Voters' heart, is do we know enough about government to see it as a tool for change? And that's what we have in a democracy. And I'm put in mind of the students who have made a movement out of reducing gun violence in schools, and they have embraced the idea. Their chant was, "We will vote you out." That they really, finally, this is a generation that is saying, we see electoral politics as a tool for us, as an avenue to change. And I don't know how we continue to capture that, but I mean, that is always my theme song. Government is there for us to make change with. That is our mechanism. And to get excited about it, I think you have to see it work.
Right, when the students from Parkland went up to Tallahassee to lobby their legislators, and they were in a session and the legislature was voting down on a technical question, a gun control bill, the media photos were of the students looking dismayed and shocked. A student had her hand to her mouth. But that was probably the best civics lesson they could have gotten. If you want to bring about change, this is the arena right here. And you need to understand how the system works so you can make the system work for you.
But what you can't do is get too complicated. True. You know, people aren't interested in the complication, and I'm not being condescending, because I'm not saying they're not smart enough. You just can't get too complicated. You know, you got to vote to make the system work for you, and somehow that message has to be hammered home all the time. But you can't get too complicated. You teach them civics in school, but you can't teach people civics in the streets or when they come out, when you're trying to get them to come out to vote. That's why the message that these people who are going door to door are delivering is the message we should be delivering all the time. And I think you do a good job of it. I think we do. You do an excellent job, by the way. The League of Women Voters has always done an excellent job.
We'll start patting each other on the back and go around.
Well, I would add to that I think you can indeed teach civics on the street with organizations such as the ones that Gladys was mentioning, with the League, with a neighbor to neighbor, with grassroots community groups. Our labor unions have had some success in teaching civics on the street. Yeah. So, but I think it requires a really concerted effort of everybody who can conceivably prioritize that, prioritizing that.
So Secretary of State Galvin has proposed a same-day registration program for Election Day. So you're not registered to vote, but you want to vote, you can walk in, do the registration, vote. It's sort of like standing in that grocery checkout line and looking at the candy bars and having that impulse buying that you want to have a candy bar now, don't you? Gladys, what do you think about the idea of that? How complicated would that be if that was put into law to implement here in Springfield, for instance?
I mean, there's prototypes across the country, so I don't think it would be too complicated for us to start that. It will have to be given an official start date, so it's not something that they can say, you know, we're going to start tomorrow, because as you know, elections are happening across the Commonwealth every single day, special elections, regular local elections. I think that, you know, if we follow Connecticut's guidelines, the only thing that I think that may become an issue would be, you know, funding it. Because if, as in Massachusetts, if we use, you know, the poll pads, if we do ballot on demand so that we, you know, can account for a certain number of voters, ballots are brought to the polling place. But if we don't know how many voters are going to turn out, if it's, you know, every single registered voter and then some, we'd have to get the technology to be able to print those ballots on demand. I think it will increase voter turnout. If the rest of the country is any indication, we will see that. I see that every election where someone will come to my counter and say, I want to vote, where do I go? We look up their name on election day and they're not here. Or if they've moved from neighboring Connecticut, New Hampshire, we get people from all over the country. We have a lot of students here in the colleges that want to vote, but they, you know, don't know enough to register 20 days beforehand. And even though we try to put it out as much as we can, and there, like we all said, there's plenty of voter registration events, there are those people that we will capture that are interested in the process on election day if we have ED registration.
Could you explain the Connecticut model? What do they do in Connecticut?
They do, you will actually go to a polling site. Theirs is a little bit more complicated in some other states where you go and you want to register, so you register here, and then you actually go and vote at your polling site, versus what you mentioned, which is going to a polling location, registering and voting at that same location.
But it's all a one-day process.
It's all a one-day process.
If they want it to be a one-day process.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's all a one-day process.
And to underscore what you were saying is, and this is a study that I have at my fingertips, Nonprofit Vote in the U.S. Elections Project, looked at same-day voter registration and its effect on turnout. And it certainly appears that the states with same-day registration had the highest turnouts in 2016. So that is an election reform that seems to make a difference. Another election reform or modernization that the League of Women Voters is pushing is automatic voter registration, which is indeed registration, turning it into an opt-out system rather than an opt-in system. But interestingly enough, in Oregon, that automatic voter registration, where everyone was invited, yes, you're a voter, only if you say, no, I don't want to be, do you not be registered. And half of those who registered in Oregon, there was a huge increase in voter registrations, but half of those who registered in the first 6 months actually went to the polls. So they increased their voter turnout by that piece of election modernization too. And there is an automatic voter registration bill in the legislature now, and
so
we
So
support
is that based on a city census? Or how does someone go to a poll and say, okay, I want to vote in Springfield?
They would go to the Registry of Motor Vehicles. So for
Okay.
us, it would be either a state agency or to the RMV. When you go there to, you know, move from Connecticut to Springfield and you're changing your license, you're automatically registered to vote. And in, for example, Oregon, you're registered to vote. And if you decide that you get something in the mail that says, congratulations, you're now an Oregonian voter and your polling place is X, Y, and Z. If you decide not to vote, then you'd have to notify Oregon that you do not want to be a registered voter. Or if you decide that you want to choose a party, because you're automatically an unenrolled voter, unless you choose a party in that state. The only problem becomes if something gets mailed to you, let's say, and it comes back to the state, it's as an invalid address or there's some problem in the mailing, then you're taken off the list. So, you know, there are things that they struggle with, but that's another option. I think the election day registration is, as far as Massachusetts and Springfield, I mean, I call it a big, small town, really, because even though we're the third largest city in the state, we still function like a town. And our politics is kind of like town politics. I think election day registration is more of something that I can see happening in Springfield and in the state of Massachusetts, and something that would increase voter turnout.
Well, let me toss a couple wild things out here. I hear this every election. You know, we got to do something about changing the voting day, changing voting day. I have heard, let's make it a federal holiday or a state holiday, so everybody has it off, so there's no excuse you're going to get to the polls because you got the day off. I've heard that. I've heard we got to put it on a Saturday when we have maybe a better percentage of people free and available to walk down the street to their polling places. Do either of those ideas excite you guys? I mean, the idea of, Gladys probably dreads it, but on the other hand, do you think this would solve these problems? If you eliminated the idea of having to go to work as a obstacle to voting by putting it on either a holiday or putting it on a Saturday. What do you think, Tim?
I think it's less the particular day than it is the period of time. So I was waiting to hear you bring up also early voting, which we had in 2016. Now, I won't speak for you, Gladys, but I know other local election officials around the state found that frustrating because there wasn't an additional set of resources provided as well. And so if early voting is really to work, you and your colleagues need support from the state in terms of setting up locations and staffing them. I'd be curious to hear your experience in 2016. How did it go as far as you were concerned?
I think it went well. I know that we actually just had a meeting yesterday at Holy Cross College with some of the city clerks across the state. And one of the things that we talked about was the possibility, because this is another piece of legislation that's kind of out there in the ether, whether I don't think it's going to take effect this year, is early voting before a primary, before the state primary, because right now early voting is only before the election, the general election in November. And we saw that it didn't increase the voter turnout because really it was kind of a wash between absentee voting and early voting. So the same number of people that would have voted by absentee voted early. But that being said, I think it was a great convenience for people. I think it allowed people to go out and vote at their leisure, and they were able to vote where they wanted to in the city. We loved it as an office. I think we initially dreaded it. We have some others, partners across the Commonwealth that did not like early voting, other city and town clerks that had a horrible experience with it. I think we were very well supported by our mayor here in Springfield and our city council that he allowed us kind of wide berth to be able to have as many sites as we thought we needed. He allowed us for additional staffing with the idea that hopefully the state would reimburse us. They did not reimburse us at levels that we had hoped. But
what a surprise.
Yeah. With that being said, I think every voter that we had come through our door had a great experience in the voting process. The fact that it was prior to some of the deadlines helped some people who weren't registered be able to register and vote right at the very beginning of early voting. So that was a great experience for Springfield. So we're actually looking forward to it in this election. I think on the reverse, to answer your first question, I don't think that a Saturday election would statistically change how many people we would have, registered to vote. The length of time prior to make it more of a convenience, as with early voting, I think would help out.
How early?
Right now it's 11 days, and I think that was a good amount of time. I think it's October 22nd that we start voting this year, and we also opened our office for longer hours, and some of the early polling sites were open to kind of account for people who can vote during the day and those that would be voting after hours. We opened Saturday, and the building was, kind of full of people.
So early voting, in your opinion, is a better solution than reconfiguring when election day would be.
Exactly.
And I think the devil's advocate argument on make it a holiday or make it a Saturday is that people might just take the day. We don't know. Would people just take the day off? Hey, it's a holiday. So that is a concern that some have raised. Yes.
And there can be very creative uses of early voting periods. When I was in grad school in North Carolina, It was in particular African American churches would do a pews to the polls set of buses because we had early voting on Sundays.
Oh, wow.
And it was a great way to use an existing organization, a cornerstone of the community, to mobilize people, get them out to vote. And studies have shown that while early voting doesn't necessarily raise turnout, it can raise turnout among specific groups. And people of color are one such group.
And I think also what it does, we've been paying a lot of attention to the actual voter experience. What happens when you go? Do you have a good time? Are you satisfied that you've actually done something when you've gone to vote? And that having the early voting period takes care of some of the barriers. I didn't have transportation. Well, I didn't have it that day, but I could do it the next day. Or as you said, oh my gosh, you know, that registration thing, all of those things that might knock you off a particular day, you've got another chance. And I just really want to give huge kudos to the city of Springfield. I remember that first meeting in Mayor Sarno's office about, hey, this early voting thing. And he and you were so open. And indeed, you won the Gold Star rating from the Election Modernization Commission Committee in Massachusetts, Coalition in Massachusetts, which was you had 3 early voting locations every single day of early voting around this, and they were different in the city. That was an amazing feat. Thank you.
I think the best testimony to the effectiveness of early voting is that the Republicans are trying so hard to stop it.
Well, that's true.
That's an interesting point. Here's another thing that's been tossed out here lately. City Councilor Nelson Rodin in Holyoke has been very active in talking about trying to lower the voting age for the city of Holyoke for municipal elections to 16 as a way of sort of building a habit of voting. You know, it's like, advertisers like to target teenagers to build those brand loyalties, you know, when they're 16 and 17, and supposedly they're going to be drinking the same soda and driving the same brand of car up until their adulthood. So would that work for voting? Would it work to say to a 16-year-old, now you can vote for city council, you can vote for mayor, for instance, you can vote in municipal elections? Again, what do you folks think about that concept as a way of sort of institutionalizing a voting habit earlier in one's life?
Well, we do know the age at which you cast your first vote does predict your voting behavior in the future. So if you get out of your 20s and you haven't voted, the odds that you'll become a voter are a lot smaller. I ask my students about this because they're a lot closer to 16 than I am. And I say, what do you think? Thinking back a few years, would you have had the judgment? And they're really split. There are some who say, yes, sure, especially for school committee. Here's the folks who just totally run our lives when we're in high school. We could do it. But then some say, well, there are some awfully complex issues out there and they're not sure. We know some countries in Europe have 16-year-old voting ages. Scotland implemented it for the independence referendum in 2014, and they actually saw a higher turnout among 16 and 17-year-olds than the 18 to 24s because of the novelty of it. But the rationale was, this is a referendum that will affect you more than anyone because it's about your future. And the research is less clear-cut in garden variety elections where you're voting for a local council or a subnational legislature. So it's a tough call.
I would be inclined to say no, too young. Except for if you combine it with regular civics education in the schools, then my inclination might shift a little bit.
And I think there is some research that shows that simply registering 16 and 17-year-olds, again, gets that involvement starting earlier. And we can now pre-register 16 and 17-year-olds who then become registered when they hit 18, or when they're going to be 18 before the election. So we have done that, and I don't know how extensive that research is, but
And good civic behavior can filter out, too. Who among us who are parents have not had our children say, "That's recyclable, Dad?" And so you could see 16 and 17-year-olds saying, "What do you mean you're not voting?" And we might see some of that good civic behavior go
Can I
up.
ask you a question before they sew this thing up? You're an expert of sorts in the whole business of polling and what have you. Do you think there is any value in doing, you said to me earlier that polling might not work, but is there some way you can survey folks with the specific purpose of determining why they won't vote?
It's a hard thing to get at,
Yeah.
because nobody wants to admit that they didn't vote. And so there are ways where you could write a question to create sort of a psychological safe space for people to say, all right, yes, I didn't vote. Because some polls will do voter validation where they'll ask people and then get their permission to look up their voting record, and you can
What
see.
if you involve the very people who aren't voting and gathering the data?
Sure, and you could run focus groups, which are much more rich in terms of the quality of it, and make it such that people feel comfortable being honest as to why, what were the barriers to voting, to make it clear. No one's here to judge. We have this ideal citizen, but we understand. And people who don't vote, it's not necessarily that they're bad citizens or they're somehow uninformed. They just may be busy. They have a lot of demands on their time and attention, and no one has laid it out for them why it matters. So sure, there are ways, but you have to be very sensitive to that sense of self-image. Very few people like to admit that they didn't vote.
Well, we need to wrap this up, but I want to give Gladys an opportunity of explaining to people how easy it is to register to vote in the city of Springfield and how they should go about it.
I think it's easier now than it's ever been. I think as we've spoken during the course of our time here today, we've touched on all of the groups that make it possible to vote, where they actually bring voter registration to you. You can register to vote on our website. You can register to vote on your phone via the Secretary of State's website. You can register to any state agency. The libraries have voter registration forms. You can come down to good old-fashioned City Hall and register to vote in our office. So I think that not being able to register to vote as a barrier is really not an excuse. I think as Rick pointed out, there are more registered people than there are unregistered eligible residents in the city of Springfield. So it's easy. It's easier now than it ever has been.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming by this afternoon. We may not have solved the problems, but at least we've raised a lot of possible solutions to this problem. And folks, thanks very much for watching another edition of Government Matters. And if you haven't registered to vote, do so today.